Well, hello everyone. It is great to be back once again. And my name is Tommy Lee. And today we have our guest host, our frequent face to everything that we're doing with Resource Global, the Growth Center, all of that. Bob Dahl, Chief Investment Officer of Crossmark Global. Bob, good morning to you.
Thanks, Tommy. Hi.
Hey, I'm looking forward to Bob. Thank you so much for jumping on. We get a chance to interview today Max McLean, award-winning actor, founder, artistic director, a New York-based Fellowship for Performing Arts. I still remember Max when I saw his performance on stage with the Screw Tape Letters. But Bob, he has done a lot on stage. C.S. Lewis, The Most Reluctant Convert, which actually ended up being a movie. The Great Divorce, Genesis, Mark's Gospel. So, Bob, I'm looking forward to this conversation with you and Max.
Great. Well, let me take it away. Max McLean, it's an honor and privilege to spend a few minutes with you, particularly as it relates to your most excellent film, The Most Reluctant Convert, and your role as C.S. Lewis. I enjoyed it so much and benefited from it. I sent it to a couple of non-believing relatives, so I'm anxious to get their reactions to what you all did.
Thank
you.
So
let's dive right in, Max, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
How and when did you realize that you had a passion for and a gifting for acting?
Well, it was pretty late, actually. I didn't do any theater in high school. I started acting in my senior year of college, primarily to get over sociophobia, which is a fear of being in front of people. So I had an experience that was very embarrassing. So I went to the weird part of campus and took an oral interpretation class, and that's where the theater bug bit. So I spent my last year working on theater projects, working on my voice, my speech, movement, learning how to interpret scripts, then went to grad school, and that became my life.
Wow, very exciting. Late in education process, but then you dove right in.
Yes.
How did you discover C.S. Lewis, and how did he capture your imagination?
Yes. What I just described in terms of my introduction to theater happened about a year before I was introduced to Jesus Christ. And I realized after I became a Christian, I didn't grow up in an evangelical world, so I didn't realize that Christians weren't supposed to be actors. But I always wanted to know, I saw great theater. Theater is about storytelling. It's about using one's voice, one's body, one's mind to illuminate great literature, great ideas, great thoughts. And I was curious as why the Christian community did not invest in it. So I started looking at material that would be able to capture the breadth, the depth, and the breadth, and the insight, and the power and inspiration of the Christian gospel. So I worked on the Bible, of course. I did a lot of Bible productions, which I loved. And then I found C.S. Lewis, and he just captured my imagination because he had this incredible ability to articulate the Christian faith in such profound ways. It really engaged my imagination. So I knew that we would spend quite a bit of time working on his material, and we did. Screw Tape Letters, The Great Divorce, and then ultimately this film.
We're so glad that we the Christian community are so glad you discovered it and decided to move into it. So to C.S. Lewis himself and this particular film, what was the most difficult part of who C.S. Lewis is for you to portray? And on the other hand, what came most naturally?
Well, I think the difficult part, it's the most difficult, but it's the most fun. It's playing somebody that smart. Being that smart for 90 minutes is really a lot of fun. Being able to articulate those words as if they're your own, because people just don't talk like that. So you had to make the power of his personality. You had to make that credible to an audience, because people have a very vested interest in how you play C.S. Lewis. So it really had to be very credible, and we worked very hard on that. In terms of his look, his costume, the way he talked, obviously the script, which was taken from his own words, and then embodying them so that people, for the length of the time of the movie, really feel they're listening to C.S. Lewis.
Wow. And you did a great job. Was 100% of the script his actual words?
Not 100, but
pretty close.
95, 96.
Wow.
A lot of segues.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was necessary to elaborate a little bit, or to simplify, those kind of things.
One of the things, among others, that fascinated me was you were the older C.S. Lewis, and Nicholas Ralph was the younger C.S. Lewis, and the film alternated between the two of you, and then in the second half, it was the two of you together often. What was that like? How did you make that work?
Well, that was the vision of the director, Norman Stone, and the idea was a little bit of a takeoff from Scrooge, living in his memories, going back in time. But the idea was he lived in his memories, and so the memories would come alive, and then he would be there in his memories physically, which we thought was really a risk, but worth exploring.
It's very effective.
Yeah. So that was the point. Yeah.
How many of the shots where the two of you were in it together, did you have to redo a lot of those?
Oh, well, it's a lot of takes. I mean, the interesting thing about film as opposed to theater, the play began as a theater piece, and theater is definitely an actor's medium. He's on stage, he controls everything. The director tends to frame the picture, but it's really about the actor. In film, it's definitely a director's medium. They do all the cuts. He has a vision of what the pictures look like, and so he is, he said, he's got it mapped out in his brain, and he said, okay, we got to do this angle, going to do this angle. He would say, really good, Max. Let's do it like this because I need to see it this way. And so there's multiple takes, but it really went pretty fast. I mean, we were doing, which is really fast for filmmaking. The script was about 100 pages, and we were doing, 9-10 pages a day.
Wow.
Which is really very, very fast. So of course, a lot of that was because I had the theater experience. So I really, really knew where it was going, and I could trust that. And I would really focus on, how to make my moment real, and then just listen to Norman in terms of, the lighting and the angles and all that.
Fascinating. Let's dive in for a few minutes to the film itself. Some points of it that I'd like to get your reaction to. Early on, C.S. Lewis' famous line, "I was angry at God for not existing."
Yeah, right.
Tell me how you dealt with that.
Well, it's his words. He had a pretty tough childhood. He lost his mother to cancer when he was 9. And that really rocked his world, because he said all settled happiness was vanished. And he had a really strange relationship with his father, which he regretted till the end of his life. His father died, I think, the year before he became a Christian. He had he experienced the butchery of trench warfare in World War I. And he called it the hell where youth and laughter go. And he came to the conclusion that either there's no God behind the universe, a God who's indifferent to good and evil, or worse, an evil God. And and so he, on the basis of that, he said that statement that no, he did not believe God existed, because it's, the options were not good. But the contradiction there, he was angry at God for not existing.
Yes.
So where was that coming from? Because he says later, if the universe has no meaning, we would never know it has no meaning. But in that is the kernel of thought that actually led out of his atheism.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned his mother's passing. That clearly had a huge impact on him. I love the line during it where he asked God to be a magician. The God that didn't exist, mind you. He asked him to be a magician. How did you deal with that part?
Well, that's interesting because actually at that point, he said, he was raised in the church, which would have been the big issue in the Irish church, the Irish Protestant church. What the big distinction was, it wasn't Catholic. So that was the big distinction, we're not them. So that's what he thought church was about. It was very tribal in his mind. But nevertheless, they did teach some of the basic doctrines of he in that scene you mentioned, he talks about he was taught that prayers offered by faith would be granted. Prayers offered by faith would be granted. So he said, I produced in prayer a firm belief in her recovery because I believe what they said.
Yes.
She died. I could, and then when she died, I worked myself into the belief that there was going to be a miracle.
Yes.
And then he says, I approached God, not as savior or as judge, but as magician. I simply wanted him to restore the status quo. And when he had done what was required of him, he would simply go away.
Yes.
But then he came to the conclusion, because God was not a magician, at his beck and call, that he came to the conclusion, well, prayer doesn't work. And then he said, I was used to things not working, thought no more about it.
What a journey, and what an ability that man had to verbalize.
Exactly.
What's going on inside his mind, and his heart. Wartime seemed to have a big effect on him also. But the line I love, Max, I'd love you to comment on was, "I never sank so low as to pray."
Yes. Well, he came back to Oxford, after the war. He attended a college meeting where they read the minutes he came back in 1919. He served from November 1918 till I think spring of 1919. So he was in the trenches for 5 months. He was wounded and sent home, and then he went back to college in the fall of 1919. So when he went back, they read the minutes to their college's last meeting from 1914, right? 5 years. There hadn't been a meeting since. And he came to the conclusion after they read those minutes, what a waste those 5 years had been, right? Yeah. He couldn't, the stupidity of warfare. And of course, he certainly had his atheistic beliefs. So somebody asked him, were you much frightened in the trenches? And he said, all the time. Yeah. But I never sank so low as to pray.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. His long quest for holiness, as he describes it. One of the lines I loved, again, with your comment, my imagination was baptized, but the rest of me took a little longer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. His imagination was baptized through reading George MacDonald's book Phantastes.
Yes.
He and quite frankly, in that period of time, he was really dabbling heavily in the occult, reading a lot of occult literature and kind of doing seances and Ouija boards and that sort of thing. And he was really in a dark place. He said, my descent went from eccentricity to perversity. He said if there'd been an elder in the neighborhood who dabbled in dirt, and he said, oh, they have a nose for potential disciples, he might now be a Satanist or a maniac. And then he said, in the superabundance of mercy, he came across this book, Fantastes, which he said just exposed all his erotic and occult fancies, and made him want to be better. And he said it was like, but he said he couldn't. He said, I couldn't. I wish I could unmake myself, but he couldn't. And he said that book baptized his imagination because it showed him holiness. It showed him goodness. And it also, but more than that, it gave him a sense of joy, which he says is different from happiness or pleasure. It's a deep feeling, which in the whole story, he connects to sort of a golden thread that God uses to bring people to himself. That all our attempts to find happiness in this life are going to fall short, because this life was only meant to arouse it, not to satisfy it. And so that began an interest that was the first step to leading him to faith in God, and then ultimately faith in Christ.
Amazing that he had those insights, because a lot of Christians struggle with the difference between joy and happiness, but he got it before he became a believer, as it were.
Yeah. Happiness and pleasure are really kind of human constructs, and joy is more of a supernatural revelation.
Yes.
That allows us to get outside of ourselves.
From the film and my limited understanding of C.S. Lewis prior to watching the film, is that G.K. Chesterton's writings and his friendship with Tolkien were hugely influential. Can you elaborate?
Yes. Well, I would say that if you look at Lewis's writings, much of his fantasy literature was influenced by George MacDonald, Fantastes. Yes. But much of his apologetic literature, Problem of Pain, Mere Christianity, that heavily influenced by G.K. Chesterton. Lewis said that Chesterton's book, Everlasting Man, was the best apologetic he'd ever written. He recommended it all the time. And it really influenced his apologetic, particularly in Problem of Pain and later Mere Christianity, because Problem of Pain is what was able to make him known to the BBC when the director of religious broadcasting at the BBC read Problem of Pain. He invited him to give the broadcast talks, which became Mere Christianity.
Fascinating. Good to know. I think the most poignant moment in the film, Max, for me was the self-examination when he looked into the mirror. And I wrote it down. What I found appalled me: depth of pride, self-admiration, zoo of lust, bedlam of ambition, nursery of fears. What a collection of words.
Very vivid.
Yeah, very vivid. Good way to put it.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Lewis's journey. He writes in that his journey to faith was he thought was a common one. It's not. He says he had no idea how few follow his path, because he went from materialism to what he called idealism, to what he called pantheism, to what he called theism, and that led him to Christ ultimately. And he wrote about that, and he said he felt it was obscured to people. But in this particular moment, what you're referencing, he was in what he called the absolute phase, meaning that he had come to the conclusion that a belief in some kind of God, kind of like the God of the philosophers, was the best alternative, when you're dealing with the idea, the absurd notion in his mind that the universe is an arbitrary alternative to nothingness. That was sort of like a big break for him. But he didn't think of God as personal at all, and then all of a sudden God was becoming personal. He said the absolute had arrived, making a nuisance of itself, issuing a command. All my acts and desires were to be brought in line with this absolute spirit that I now believed.
Uh-huh.
And then he says, and what I thought, he says that caused him to do a sort of a self-inventory, a confession. And he was appalled by what he saw inside him. He said, like he's a zoo of lust, bedlam of ambition, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatred. He said, he goes further. He says, my name is Legion, referencing the demoniac in the Gospels.
Yeah.
And so, he's really wrestling. And this is an experience that I had. I knew the reality that I was an evil man. I was a bad person. Oh Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. But I, for a long time, I didn't want to face it. So I ran away, and he had been running away, but now he felt like he can't run any longer. And so that was, that moved him towards what he called theism. And theism is a very soft word nowadays, and so we don't make much of it. But in his mind, he was actually talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He said his religion was like that of the Jews.
Yes.
It was like, he was like Moses at the burning bush, and that that just floored him. And he said that's when he gave in and admitted that God is God, knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected, reluctant convert in all England.
Yes, amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
How much time was there, do you know, between his acceptance of theism and his acceptance of Christianity?
Yeah, not a lot, actually. It says in the play, and which came from his autobiography, in the Trinity term 1929, I gave in, admitted that God is God. That would have been somewhere like May and June of 1929. But if people look at his diaries very closely, he misremembered. He was probably talking about the Trinity term 1930. So that's when he had this theistic revelation. But then he also says, I remember very well when, but hardly how, the final step was taken. I was being driven by my brother Warney to Whipsnade Zoo in the sidecar of a motorcycle one sunny morning in the autumn of 1931.
You've got the lines down.
Yeah. So that's kind of the length of time. So the summer of 30 to the autumn of 31.
Got it. Not a long time, as you say. Well, we all know his logic, and it's got to stop people in their tracks. He either is, that is the Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, or he was a lunatic, a liar, and a fraud. You cannot call him a good teacher. It's one way or the other. And he brought that home, did he not?
Yeah, he did. I mean, people would argue, the argument that they have is Jesus didn't really say these things, that they were, made up by his disciples and have become legend. But then, that's pretty, when you read the Gospels, they're not legendary writing. And this is something that Lewis brought up. So the logic of it is very strong. He also, I think it's very important, prior to that, the logic from materialism to theism was, his argument against God was that the universe was so cruel and unjust. And this goes back to your first question.
Yes.
So cruel and unjust.
Right.
But he asked, where did I get this notion of cruel and unjust?
Yeah.
I call a line crooked because I have some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with?
Yes.
When I called it cruel and unjust.
Yeah.
So you start there, and then all of a sudden, he said, I believe in God, but I still don't understand how the life and death of someone else, whoever he was 2,000 years later, could help 2,000 years ago, could help us here and now. And his late nights conversation with Tolkien, when Tolkien told him that, the story of Christ is a myth. Well, he said to him, when you meet a god sacrificing himself in a pagan story, like Dionysus, Balder, Osiris, all the myths, he said, you like it very much and are mysteriously moved by it, provided you meet it anywhere except in the Gospels.
Right.
Yeah, and he says the story of Christ is also a myth, like the other myths, with one tremendous difference. It really happened. And so what that did for Lewis, it made him go back to the Gospels and reread them, and read them more like a heroic story, as opposed to a prescriptive do this, do that. And it opened his eyes to who this Jesus was. He said, I've always existed. Before Abraham was, I am. Nobody gets to the Father except through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. This guy's crazy. Or he's not.
Yes. Fascinating. Thanks for that insight. So when you look back, Max, it's clear C.S. Lewis was someone who vehemently denied the faith and then became a huge proponent of the faith for society in general. Mm-hmm. The head and the heart, they both have to get there. Because he's such an intellectual, we think so much about the head. Can you distinguish, as you understand C.S. Lewis, this head versus heart acceptance of Christianity?
Well, in many ways, that is a false dilemma. Obviously,
yes.
And it certainly was in Lewis's case, because he felt like if something was true, it had consequences, that it required some kind of acceptance, or else, you're going to have kind of a schizophrenic brain, and that's kind of where our culture has gone.
Yes,
because it's separated, logical, rational truth from reality. It's like it's a separate thing, and then of course it's tied up into postmodernism that every truth claim is a power grab, and so all of that makes it very, very. So we get this thing, and what that does is that we tend to value these sort of emotional, expressive, these love songs to Jesus, and that tends to make people uncomfortable. I mean, not some people love it, but other people say, "Well, I'm not there yet." Right. So there has to be this real sense of both.
Yes,
and I think that Lewis is probably the best example of how to do that.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Couple wrap-up questions. You referenced to one of the questions, kind of your quest for Christianity had some similarities to C.S. Lewis, was probably part of why you were drawn to him. How did making this film strengthen your faith?
Well, Lewis just affirms so much. It gives you a much, much deeper emotional settledness on the truth claims of Christianity and the reality of Jesus Christ that is very, very compelling. He also, I wrote this quote down. I wrote it down because I don't know if I know it very well, but let me see if I can find it. I can't find it, but anyway, I'll try to paraphrase it. He said that he didn't believe that intellectual arguments create belief, because what may be believed may not be accepted. What we talked about, what may be proved may not be accepted. But he said something very interesting that I think is really important for our culture today. He says, however, what no one takes the trouble to explain or defend is soon abandoned.
Mm,
And I thought, okay, that's what's happening in our culture.
yeah.
Because, like, we think of, let's say, our colleges and universities. Uh, it's not that they think Christianity is nefarious. They just think it's irrelevant, and so it's not made. The case is just simply not made. And so what happens? People just begin to think it's unimportant. It's a private thing that you can do on Sundays, but it has no relevance to Monday to Friday. And Lewis disabuses that notion, and that's been very, very important for me.
Wow. What are you working on now, Mac?
I'm working on a second a follow-up Lewis piece that when Lewis was converted to Christianity in the autumn of 1931, he was 32 years old. It wasn't obvious that he would become the most influential Christian writer of the past 100 years. That just wasn't obvious. A lot of people get converted, they don't become C.S. Lewis. So what happened from like 1932 to 1940, 45 that made Lewis become Lewis? What were the influences? What were the providential steps that made Lewis this international apologist that is probably the most, like I said, the most influential Christian of the past 100 years? And so that's what I'm working on now.
Fascinating. Well, Max McLean, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this. More importantly, your ability to bring C.S. Lewis, a great man of faith, down to our level so we can understand and appreciate and give greater thanks for C.S. Lewis. So thank you.
Delighted.
Tommy, back to you.
Actually, Max, do you mind if I ask one quick question before we end?
Yeah, sure.
For those who are listening, and Bob, you've been an active speaker, professional speaker. Max, what's your advice for preachers? Because you're able to tell a story. You're able to do it in a conversation-like style. Sometimes with pastors, there's a tendency to feel like you're tied into your script or anything. How do you create your natural voice? What would your advice be?
Boy, that's a tough question. I mean, you work at it, and first of all, you have a picture of what that looks like, like you just described it, and so you try to make that obvious. Obviously, the first thing is the script. A lot of times, the words on the page don't lend themselves to the kind of conversation you're referencing. And one of the things Lewis mentioned, he says that, unless you can make your point in a way that reaches the common person, you don't really know it. And I think that's a very interesting thought, because and one of the things I find is that when preachers, for instance, they go to a Bible school, they go to seminary, they learn the theology at a very deep level, and they bring that to the church. But what's missing is the translation, because the people in the pew didn't have the same experience. You're with other pastors and other seminary students, and so you're kind of talking to them instead of talking to people that have very little reference points of what's going on. So, and I think that's a learned skill, and really smart pastors, they really understand their audience, and so they tend to make adjustments, and the ones that succeed do that well.
Very good. Very good. Bob, thank you. Max, thank you for taking time out for this interview. What an honor. And it has been an honor just watching you on stage. Thank you so much for your service.
Well, thank you both. I really enjoyed this.
God bless you, Max.
Thanks so much.